Happy Easter! Christ is risen! Now, if I'm being completely honest, it is hard for me to say Happy Easter these days. The celebratory aspect of Easter seems to have gone to the wayside. There are no longer family or church gatherings, no potlucks, no church Easter breakfast, and even Easter egg hunts seem harder to plan and organize these days. Our traditions have been completely tossed out the window this year. And this is hard. It does not exactly feel like a happy occasion, and it's not what we expected. Furthermore, as we continue on in this journey of self-isolation and social distancing, the days begin to run together. It gets longer and harder, and everything seems to take more effort. Overall, things can feel bleak and even hopeless. So, today we are not where we expected to be, and overall, life might feel hopeless. Not exactly a cheery start to an Easter morning message, is it? But this can actually help us in identifying with the disciples of Christ. They also, at the time of Jesus' death, were not where they expected to be, and they also were feeling quite hopeless. And yet, it was in the unexpected that the disciples ended up finding hope. This is what I want to go over today, that in the unexpected, and especially the unexpectedness of the resurrection, we can find hope. Now, I'll open in saying that much of the material I'm using today comes from N.T. Wright's book, Surprised by Hope. I turned to this book a couple weeks ago when I was searching for stories of hope, because I find that reading and hearing stories of hope is one of the best ways for me to keep up my own spirits when things are feeling particularly dark and bleak. And I'd encourage you to do the same and perhaps even share your own stories of hope in the comments below. Now, to begin, I already mentioned that the resurrection was unexpected. Certainly, the death and resurrection was not what Jesus' followers were expecting. They were expecting him to come in power and might, or in other words, they were expecting some sort of demonstration of physical force. They expected immediate liberation and salvation from the oppression by the Roman rule. Thus, when Jesus died, people assumed he was not actually the Messiah they had hoped for. And therefore, the resurrection was also unexpected. They just assumed Jesus was dead, and that was the end of it. So the resurrection was unexpected. But as N.T. Wright notes, that's not all that was unexpected. The various accounts of Jesus' resurrection in and of themselves are unexpected. And yes, there are various accounts. They do not all align perfectly with one another. And yet there are commonalities amongst all of them. And these commonalities, there's 4 of them, but all the commonalities are unexpected, and they break character with how ancient accounts are usually told. They even break character with how the Gospels have been told up to that point. And this is completely unexpected. So the 4 commonalities, and I'm going to breeze through these pretty quickly, but the 4 commonalities are as follows. First off, all of the accounts are virtually silent in regards to the Old Testament scripture. Usually in the Gospels up to that point, we find the saying, this was done to fulfill what was written in, and then it'll name a book or a scripture from the Old Testament. And this trend is completely absent in the resurrection accounts. And there are passages that can be used from the Old Testament to support the resurrection, but they are not present. And this suggests that the resurrection was not expected even from reading the Old Testament. Secondly, even if people were somehow expecting Jesus to be raised from the dead based on Old Testament scriptures, and there was a small portion of people who believed in the resurrection, but they did not expect it in the way that it happened. The portrait of Jesus in the resurrection tale was not what people expected from someone being raised from the dead. They expected the Messiah to come in radiant light, shining for all to see. And yet, Jesus came as a figure that was unrecognizable, a fellow traveler on the road or a gardener. He was completely hidden from everyone, and he chose to only reveal himself to certain people at certain times. It's not at all what was expected from a resurrection. And thirdly, these accounts were always told from the perspective of a woman. And this was completely unheard of in ancient times. Back then, if you wanted something to be believable, you'd have a man tell the story. And yet, in each of the accounts, it's always a woman who finds the empty tomb. And then they're the ones who encounter Christ, and it is always the woman who is entrusted with telling the disciples. And then lastly, each account has no mention of the future Christian hope. They never say, because Jesus was raised from the dead, now we too will be raised with Christ one day. Rather, this account had a very immediate meaning to it. It was understood that Jesus was raised from the dead, therefore the Messiah lives now, and a new creation has already begun. There wasn't a hope for a later date, but there was an immediate hope for the present. Still, to not include the future hope is quite unusual and unexpected for an account written to later generations. So to recap, there were 4 unexpected features to each account of Jesus' resurrection. These unexpected commonalities actually point to the truthfulness behind the accounts. The 4 gospel accounts all have variations to the stories, and yet these 4 commonalities remain. And because the accounts are so different and yet have these very unexpected characteristics in common, it points to the actual resurrection being true. It's as the old saying goes from Sherlock Holmes: when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Now, I don't bring this up to try and prove that the resurrection happened. I think there is still an element of faith that is needed for that belief, and getting into an argument over it has rarely resulted in someone changing their mind. So I don't bring this up to prove the truth of the resurrection. Rather, I bring this up because it is so out of character with the other literary elements of the Gospels that we need to pay attention to it. It is so unexpected that we need to take a closer look at the truth that is being communicated and the implications it has for us today. So, what exactly is the truth behind the resurrection? What is being communicated in these accounts? And for starters, the resurrection of Jesus was the beginning of a new creation. It's not just that Jesus was raised from the dead and then things went back to normal. We kind of saw a piece of what that would look like with Lazarus, and we even hear stories today where people are raised from the dead, and those ones are often explained away with various scientific explanations. However, Jesus' resurrection is completely different, and it actually marks the beginning of a new creation and a new world and a new way of being. It's different in that it defies the physics of this world as we know it, and not just in the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead. But from this point on, we hear about Jesus taking the form of a traveler or a gardener, and he is completely unrecognizable to the people who knew him best. And yet, while he is completely unrecognizable, he speaks one word, and all of a sudden, it's as though he reverts back to his old physical self. His followers all of a sudden recognize him. It's as though he is now a shapeshifter. And furthermore, he is also able to miraculously appear in a room that was completely locked down to outsiders. In one moment he wasn't there, and in the next, Jesus is magically before his disciples. So Jesus is a shapeshifter, and he can pass through walls. Sounds kind of like a sci-fi story. But it shows that Jesus is a completely new creation that defies the physics of this world as we know it. Now, it might be said that Jesus can do that because he is God and is not of this world. But we must remember that this is the resurrected Jesus. He was made entirely of flesh, and it was of this old flesh that died that this new creation was made of. This Jesus had not yet returned to God, and so he was still entirely human and entirely physical flesh. And again, this Jesus completely defied the physics of this world as we know it. An entirely new creation had been formed out of the old. Therefore, Jesus' resurrection is the defining moment of a new creation. The beginning of a new world had been born in the resurrection of Christ, and with new creation, there is also hope. N.T. Wright writes that hope is what you get when you suddenly realize that a different worldview is possible. A worldview in which the rich, the powerful, and the unscrupulous do not, after all, have the last word. With the resurrection and the new creation in Jesus, there was a realization that things could be different. There was a new hope, and that hope for the disciples was immediate. It was not, well, Jesus rose from the dead, therefore we might also be raised from the dead one day. It was not that, but rather it was Jesus is now raised from the dead. Therefore, a new world and a new way of being has already begun. This new world is not one that is ruled by the rich and powerful and the people who will seek personal gain at the expense of others. But rather, this new world is marked by unconditional love and the giving up of oneself for the benefit of others. Furthermore, this new world is not one to be simply enjoyed at a later date after our bodily deaths, but this is a new creation that we are invited to participate in now. There is hope in the new creation of the resurrection, and it results in showing love to those around us and not being consumed by greed, lust, envy, anger, or even fear. Now, it needs to be noted that yes, death still happens around us. But this reality unfortunately results in some saying that this life doesn't really matter. They say, well, I just need to wait until the afterlife. Life after death is where things get good. Therefore, this life and this world do not really matter. And this has resulted in an understanding that life after death, or our salvation, means going to heaven when we die. Now, there is some understanding of this within the Bible, but it also needs to be stated that heaven is not our final destination. After all, salvation really means rescue. If we die physically, but our souls or some other ambiguous part of us goes on to live in heaven, then how have we actually been rescued? How has death lost its sting if we also are not physically resurrected? Therefore, our hope lies in our resurrection and in our own salvation, which can happen because of Jesus Christ. As N.T. Wright puts it, our hope is in the life after death. So yes, there still is some understanding of us going to heaven when we die, but that is not the resurrection. With that view, there is hope for tomorrow, but little hope for today. Instead, I propose we view heaven as more of a resting place as we await the resurrection. We are not destined to join Jesus in heaven, but rather we are destined for a new creation where Jesus will one day join us again in this physical world. Our hope lies in a physical new creation that is ruled by life and love, as opposed to a physical world that is ruled by corruption, oppression, death, and decay. And there is hope today because that world has already begun through the resurrection of Christ. Yes, we await for that resurrection ourselves, but we can still participate in that world because it has already begun. In the new creation started at Jesus' resurrection, we have found hope. Now, I think today more than ever, this is important for us to remember. We are in a time where illnesses and death are all around us with the pandemic. The old world still has influence on us, but we need not let that rule our lives. Today, more than ever, we need to show our love and care to the world around us. We need to show our support to our friends, to our families, and to our neighbors. And yes, it is hard to do so when things are so much more difficult compared to what we're used to. And we do need to be careful about how we are in contact with the people around us. Yet, in this new time where things are different and difficult, it also means that we need to get creative in how we respond and in how we are the church. In being creative, we will also get to participate in new creation, and in doing so, we will also find hope. Now, to end, I want to once again leave you with a quote from N.T. Wright. He says, "Hope is what you get when you suddenly realize that a different worldview is possible. A worldview in which the rich, the powerful, and the unscrupulous do not, after all, have the last word. The same worldview shift that is demanded by the resurrection of Jesus is the shift that will enable us to transform the world."